The Mexican-American War, when Texas caused a giant breakup. The Mexican-American War, a 2-year drama, April 1846 to February 1848, that started when the United States decided Texas was totally theirs, and Mexico responded with a diplomatic eye roll and a firm nope. The root of the problem? A good old-fashioned border squabble. Mexico said Texas stopped at the Nueces River. The U.S. insisted it went all the way to the Rio Grande. That's a 150-mile difference, basically a Texas-sized disagreement. Spoiler alert, the U.S. won. Repeatedly. And in the end, they walked away with a massive chunk of Mexican land, more than 500,000 square miles stretching from the Rio Grande to the Pacific Ocean. That's not a land grab, that's a continental expansion pack. Chapter 1, Polk's Plot Twist, American Blood on American Soil. Let's rewind to 1845. The U.S. had just annexed Texas and Mexico was not sending any "congratulations on your new state" cards. In fact, they cut off all diplomatic ties faster than you can say, manifest destiny. President James K. Polk, think of him as a 19th century power player with expansionist dreams, dispatched a guy named John Slidell to Mexico City with a mission. Buy New Mexico and California for up to $30 million, settle some debts, and maybe charm the Mexicans with a smile and a handshake. But Mexican President José Joaquín Herrera took one look at that offer and decided not to even open the door. Why? Because he knew the U.S. wasn't just offering cash, they were offering a territorial garage sale with Mexico's stuff. When Slidell got ghosted, Polk didn't take it well. He sent General Zachary Taylor to march into the disputed area between the Nueces and Rio Grande. Because nothing says "we're still friends" like parking troops on land you don't officially own. Then came the plot twist. On April 25, 1846, Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande and clashed with Taylor's forces. 16 American soldiers were killed or wounded. Polk was ready. Like pre-writing his speech ready. By May 11th, he had whipped up a dramatic message to Congress. Mexico has invaded our territory and shed American blood on American soil. And just like that, war was on. Spot resolutions and civil disobedience. When Americans argued over a war they already started. On May 13, 1846, Congress officially gave the thumbs up to the Mexican-American War, but it wasn't exactly a group hug. While Democrats, especially in the Southwest, were cheering like it was a football game, many Whigs were looking around saying, "Wait a second, are we sure we're the good guys here?" President Polk had painted the conflict as a noble response to unprovoked aggression. But the Whigs, never once to blindly accept presidential storytelling, weren't buying it. They questioned whether American blood had actually been spilled on American soil, or if Polk had just moved the goalposts and called it a touchdown. In fact, some of them thought Polk's declaration of war had all the constitutional legitimacy of a pirate ship constitution. The central question was, where exactly did the first shots fire? Was it U.S. land as Polk claimed? Or disputed territory, or worse, Mexican land? The Whigs weren't just murmuring behind closed doors. By December 1846, Polk was so fed up with their criticism that he basically accused them of treason. That escalated quickly. A month later, the Whig-controlled House struck back, voting to censure Polk. The charge? He had unnecessarily and unconstitutionally picked a fight with Mexico. Political drama 1840 style. Enter Abraham Lincoln, young Whig troublemaker. Now here's where things get spicy. A fresh-faced, one-term congressman from Illinois, some guy named Abraham Lincoln, stood up and said, "Show me the spot." Literally. In December 1847, Lincoln introduced the famous spot resolutions, demanding that President Polk pinpoint the exact location where American blood had allegedly been spilled. Was it actually on U.S. soil, or just somewhere Polk wished was U.S. soil? Lincoln wasn't trying to win popularity contests. He was trying to inject some historical context and accountability into a war that, to him, smelled a little too much like a land grab wrapped in patriotic packaging. Did Congress jump to support Lincoln's bold move? No. His spot resolutions went nowhere. But they showed that not everyone was on board with Polk's expansionist vision. And while Polk stuck to his narrative like a man defending his favorite plot twist, Lincoln's skeptical voice would echo through American history. The invasion begins, Santa Anna's surprise comeback and a march to Mexico City. Once war broke out in the Mexican-American War, things got weird, fast. Out of the blue, former Mexican President and General Antonio López de Santa Anna, yes, that's Santa Anna, the same guy who crushed the Texans at the Alamo in 1836, popped up from exile in Cuba and contacted U.S. President James K. Polk. Santa Anna promised he'd help broker peace if Polk could just, arrange a quick boat ride back to Mexico. Polk, thinking this was a genius move, said sure. So the U.S. Navy gave Santa Anna a lift, expecting him to play peacemaker. Instead, Santa Anna stepped off the ship, stretched, dusted off his uniform and said, "Peace? Nah, I'm taking charge of the Mexican army." Classic plot twist. America's three-pronged game plan. The U.S. stuck to its original plan. General Zachary Taylor led troops from the Rio Grande straight into northern Mexico. Meanwhile, Colonel Stephen Kearny was sent west to capture New Mexico and California, which, surprisingly, went off without much resistance. The locals there seemed less fired up to fight, and more meh about the U.S. takeover. Back in the Northeast, Taylor was making moves. He fought battles south of the Rio Grande, captured the city of Monterrey, and won big at the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847. But there was a problem. Taylor wasn't exactly charging full steam ahead. After a few wins, he sort of took his foot off the gas. Polk, unimpressed with the general's chill attitude, decided to switch things up. Enter General Winfield Scott and the Long March. Polk called in General Winfield Scott, who made a bold entrance. He took his troops by sea, landed at Veracruz, laid siege for 3 weeks, and then launched an epic march straight toward Mexico City. It was like a 19th-century version of shock and awe, minus the helicopters. Scott's campaign was smooth, decisive, and full of W's. By September 14, 1847, he had marched into the capital. Mexico City had fallen, and with it, the military phase of the war came to a dramatic end. The real enemy, germs. Now, if you thought the battles were the biggest killer in the Mexican-American War, think again. Combat took around 1,500 U.S. lives, but disease? It wiped out over 10,000. Poor sanitation, especially among volunteer troops who apparently thought soap was optional, led to outbreaks of yellow fever, measles, mumps, and smallpox. Troops from rural areas, who hadn't exactly been exposed to much, were especially vulnerable. In short, the latrines did more damage than the lancers. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when the clerk ignored the president and sealed the deal anyway. With Mexico City under U.S. control and Santa Anna once again packing up his bags, the war was pretty much over. All that was left was to officially end it with a treaty, ideally signed before Polk exploded from impatience. Enter Nicholas Trist, the chief clerk of the State Department. Polk had sent Trist along with General Scott's forces to negotiate peace. But negotiations were slow. Painfully slow. As in, waiting for paint to dry on a cactus slow. Eventually, Polk lost his presidential patience and told Trist to come home. But Trist had other ideas. Instead of booking his return ticket, he stayed in Mexico, pulled out his pen and, in direct defiance of the president, signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2, 1848. Ballsy? Yes. Career-ending? Almost. But it worked. The treaty was ratified by both governments and changed the map forever. Mexico handed over an absolutely massive chunk of land, basically everything that would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, Texas, and parts of Colorado, in exchange for $15 million and the U.S. agreeing to absorb American citizens' claims against Mexico. A deal that made the Louisiana Purchase look like a yard sale. From general to president, and the slavery debate rekindled. Meanwhile, Zachary Taylor, thanks to his battlefield heroics, became an overnight national idol and, soon after, President of the United States in 1849. Not bad for a guy who wasn't super into invading Mexico in the first place. But peace came with a catch. The war had unearthed a ticking political time bomb. Slavery. The big question now? Would the new Western territories allow slavery or not? In 1846, Congressman David Wilmot tried to sneak a little something called the Wilmot Proviso into a spending bill. It basically said, no slavery in any territory we snag from Mexico. It didn't pass, but boy did it stir the pot. The debate was loud, angry, and only got worse. That unresolved tension led the nation right to the brink of civil war, and then, eventually all the way into it. A training ground for the Civil War's greatest and worst generals. Ironically, the Mexican-American War ended up being a warm-up round for the Civil War. Many of the major military players on both sides of that later conflict got their start in Mexico. We're talking Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Ulysses S. Grant, James Longstreet, George Meade, George Pickett, P.G.T. Beauregard, and the list goes on. Years later, Grant himself would call the Mexican-American War one of the most unjust ever waged by a stronger against a weaker nation. And he was there. The legacy of the Mexican-American War. So, what did the Mexican-American War leave behind? A massive territorial expansion for the U.S. A constitutional showdown between president and clerk. A revived and vicious national debate over slavery. A generation of battle-hardened officers who'd soon find themselves fighting each other. And a war that many remember more for its consequences than for its causes. It wasn't just a land war, it was a turning point. And like all good turning points in American history, it came with heroes, villains, unintended consequences, and just enough irony to make future generations say, "Wait, what?" Aftermath in Mexico, shock, stereotypes, and a very awkward silence. While the U.S. walked away from the Mexican-American War with a boatload of new land and some national chest-thumping, Mexico was left in pieces, literally and politically. The war completely discredited the conservative faction in Mexico. Leaders who had promised strength and stability had instead presided over catastrophic defeat and the loss of nearly half the country's territory. Let's just say their approval ratings didn't survive the surrender. What remained was a stunned and despondent nation, grappling with national humiliation, internal chaos, and the question, where do we go from here? To make matters worse, the war deepened the worst stereotypes each country had of the other. Americans viewed Mexicans as disorganized and backwards, conveniently ignoring their own questionable war justification, while many Mexicans saw Americans as greedy, land-hungry invaders dressed up in democracy. Spoiler, neither side was entirely wrong. As for getting back to normal? That took time. A long time. Diplomatic relations resumed slowly, like two people trying to be friends again after a brutal breakup. One where one side took the house, the car, and half the backyard. Final thoughts. The Mexican-American War may have lasted just 2 years, but its legacy? That lingered for decades, shaping U.S. expansion, reigniting the slavery debate, and scarring the Mexican political landscape. It was a war of maps, ambitions, and mixed morals, and it changed the trajectory of both nations forever.